You know an ad is good when it has its own Wikipedia page. Today we're looking at an Apple ad that came out in 1984 that some consider to be one of the greatest ads of all time. And we're going to break it down and look at its impact not only from a commercial or advertising perspective, but also just from a cultural perspective. That's often the case when it comes to Apple ads. In the press, this ad has been called a masterpiece in advertising. It's been inducted into the Clio Awards Hall of Fame. It's in Advertising Age's top 50 greatest ads of all time. It's TV Guide's #1 commercial of all time, and it's also considered by some to be the greatest Super Bowl spot of all time. So a ton of awesome accolades. This is an ad that ran only one time during 1984's Super Bowl, and it was also an ad that Apple's board of directors didn't want to run until Steve Jobs really pushed for it. Some context on the ad before we jump into it. This ad introduces the Macintosh product. It has a budget of $900K, which is about $2.3 million in today's dollars. And it's made by Chiat, the longtime collaborator and ad agency that Apple has worked with in the past. Also attached to the ad is the renowned creative director Lee Clow and Ridley Scott, the popular movie director, who at the time, in 1984, he was just a few years removed from directing Alien and also Blade Runner. So pretty high-profile person to be working on an ad that, of course, you sometimes see with these bigger budget productions. As I mentioned, the runtime of this ad is 1 minute. It's run only on the Super Bowl and a handful of local channels. Now, if you haven't seen this ad before, it's going to strike you, maybe in a good or a bad way. So let's just jump right into it, give it a whirl, and then we'll break it down.
6:32 left to play in Super Bowl 18. Raiders 28-9.
Today we celebrate the first glorious anniversary of the Information Purification Directives. We have created, for the first time in all history, a garden of pure ideology, where each worker may bloom, secure from the pests, obeying contradictory laws. Unification of thoughts is more powerful a weapon than any fleet or army on earth. We are one people, with one will, one resolve, one cause. Our enemies shall talk themselves to death, and we will bury them with their own confusion. We shall prevail.
On January 24th, Apple Computer will introduce Macintosh. And you'll see why 1984 won't be like 1984.
The magic of CBS Sports Sunday is the WBC Super Lightweight Championship, World Cup skiing, and the World...
So the commercial starts in sort of a spooky and unsettling location. It clearly looks like some dystopian futuristic world where a bunch of people dressed in monochrome colors are marching expressionless down a corridor. And as you see later in the ad, they're aggregating at this big meeting hall. And when you hear the ambience, the unsettling, spooky, even the scary tone of the speech, and the whole setting is really meant to invoke George Orwell's 1984, this whole feeling of a dystopian future where society has clearly veered down the wrong path. The whole time in the background, you hear the speech being delivered that's very authoritarian and very, very serious and stern in tone. And without even paying too much about the actual words that are being said, the overall spirit of it is really speaking about conformity, oneness, and unitedness. And as you see these expressionless people congregate in the meeting hall, you also see a bunch of police officers charging down the hall, chasing after someone. And you quickly see this lady charging down the hall with this giant hammer, and her color palette clearly jumps out of the page. While everybody else is intently staring, motionless and expressionless at the screen, listening to this person speak, this lady charges into the room. She starts whirling the hammer around, throwing it like as if it were a shot put. And just as the speech comes to an apex, her hammer is launched into the screen, destroying it. And that's when you finally see the crowd react. And as soon as that happens, roll the ad copy. On January 24th, Apple Computer will introduce Macintosh, and you'll see why 1984 won't be like 1984. I think what jumps out to me is, one, the tone. Obviously, by today's standards, it would be very, very unique and maybe a little bit odd to have something so stern and scary. And there's absolutely no mention of the product till the very end and just no imagery of the product. The core message here is really to draw the viewer in through some very compelling, almost movie quality like imagery, and grip them until the very end, where they see this whole scene play out without any context. And finally, at the very end, you realize it's Apple drawing comparisons between their product and 1984. So that's the ad itself. The next question is really, now that you've seen it, is this the greatest ad of all time, or is it really up there as one of the greats? One of the big plays of this ad is to pit IBM, one of Apple's big competitors at the time, as the bad guy. So in the ad, the lady sprinting down the hall, destroying the screen, is supposed to represent Apple, to represent Macintosh, really freeing these people from this authoritarian repression. And when we put it in context, in 1984, the PC was not yet ubiquitous as it is today. IBM at the time was the big player in the computing space, this big mega corporation. And Apple was actually the smaller player who is positioning themselves as enabling and empowering the individual person through the use of their personal computers. And Steve Jobs and Apple had this way of positioning Apple as a societal force, really zooming out of the product's specifications themselves. Again, this ad makes no mention of the Mac until the very end. It doesn't show the product or talk about what the product does too much. It really just tries to slot Apple into the broader conversation about the individual versus society, about conformity versus thinking different. That's really the real value of this ad and the real impact and efficacy of it. While this ad did run one time during the Super Bowl and got a lot of initial exposure, the real runtime of the ad was actually not even paid for. It was the organic publicity it garnered and the public discussion of the ad after it ran. At the time, nobody had seen an ad that was portrayed in such a way. So it was rebroadcast in news articles, on TV. It was just a big topic of discussion. And that sort of uniqueness, breaking out of the mold, really set a precedent for advertising in that since 1984, Super Bowl commercials have gotten a lot more creative, a lot more larger than life. They usually operate very differently from your typical marketing beats and typical commercials. And when it comes to fancy media outlets and advertising executives doling out accolades for different ads, we can quickly see why Apple, in this case, was very beloved. So do I personally think this is the greatest ad of all time? Well, again, I think it needs to be judged in context. If we look at it through the lens of the year 1984, it's clearly very, very different from anything that has run before it. And that sort of societal impact it has is undeniable. And I think even if we look at it through today's lens, it's clearly graduated into a piece of Apple's mythology. It continues to be seen by folks today, like in this video, because of its initial uniqueness and impact. I think regardless, it is quite a risky creative concept. It's very hard to imagine your normal advertiser going an ad that's so out there like this one, where it's so driven by this story, by this unusual tone. And I think maybe that's what makes Apple Apple. It's hard to imagine other folks doing this because I don't think every advertiser can get away with this type of ad. I think if you're a world-class brand like Apple or Nike, you can really use this type of uniqueness because people are going to give you the benefit of the doubt. Overall, I think it speaks to Steve Jobs' direction and really unique vision for Apple's brand. Many years later, Apple will continue with this sort of storytelling with their Think Different campaign. So I think this ad has a very unique position in advertising history. One, because it kicks off a really unique strand of thinking different that Apple uses throughout its early history with Steve Jobs. And it sets such a powerful precedent for a lot of commercials who have tried to take after it in terms of using these very unique, bold statements to inject themselves into public discourse. So love it or hate it, I think it really has its own place in advertising history because of the impact it's made, and those ripples continue to affect advertising today.